Hey guys, welcome back to my Practically Imperfect Life. If you've been around for a while, you know that I love reading and I enjoy all different kinds of books, but it has been a while since I've done much in the way of sharing books with you guys. And I have a stack of books that I have read in the last couple of weeks that I just really wanted to share with you guys because they cover a wide variety of age ranges. I have been asked by authors to take a look at some of their books, and I wanted to share that with you. And I have books that I've been reading for homeschool, books I've been reading for enjoyment, and there's just so many good ones out there, and I wanted to share just a few with you today. I think what I will do is I will go through these books in age order. So those for the youngest readers first, and then we'll just work our way up to adults. And the first book I have is He Is Always With Me. Now this is written by Laval Ashbrooks. This author actually emailed me and asked if I would take a look at this book and let you guys know what I think. And it is an adorable little book. It's basically about a little boy, and he got scared at night, and his dad comes in and they have a little song they sing that reminds him how God is always with him. And I thought it was just a sweet little story. I teach a Sunday school class which has preschoolers and kindergarten, first grade ages. And so I thought this book was great to share with them as well, just as a reminder that, of course, God is always with you no matter what is going on, what is happening, whether you're scared, whether you're happy, whether you're awake, whether you're asleep. It's just a very nice little reminder. The book has a lot of rhyme in it, so it makes it easy for kids to follow along with and quickly pick up on the words and the lines and be able to repeat that main phrase that God is always with me that is throughout it. So I really appreciate him sending out this book to me to check out. I will go ahead and I will link it down below in the description box. I've got an Amazon link for it if you would like to pick it up. Very cute book for our younger readers. Now the second book is one that I actually don't have a physical copy of, but I was introduced to it in an interesting way. I have a friend who teaches English and language arts at a local Christian school, and she actually asked if I would substitute for her for a couple of days, and I said of course I would. And I went in, and this was the book that they were studying. It was called The Wild Robot. Now you might have heard of this book. I believe it's part of a series, and I saw that they're actually going to make it into a movie, but I had never heard of the book before this. I guess it must have been published after my kids had moved beyond that age range. This is a great book for your elementary age students. If you have students who need maybe shorter chapters in order to keep them engaged and keep them working through the books, or if you want a great book to do as a read out loud. Basically, it's a story about a robot, and there's a boating accident. She's the only robot that, quote, survives, and she comes onto this island and she begins to interact with nature and with all of the different animals that are there. And she learns how to basically, be a part of this little animal society from the other animals. They're teaching her all different things. Along the way, she adopts a little baby goose and becomes basically like a surrogate mother. And it's this whole clash between what she is programmed to do and what she's learning is the right thing and how she's supposed to respond. It's just a very interesting little story. I thought it was just very sweet. It's a wonderful book to do as a read out loud because there's all of these different animal characters, and you can definitely have some fun with those animal voices. I know I did when I was doing the read out loud part when I was subbing. I really enjoyed playing the role of like the squirrel and the little goose and the robot and just coming up with fun voices to do. And I got done with those few days of subbing and I thought, I really have to read this whole book now. So I went and got a copy from the library and read it, and I just thought it was just the sweetest story for those elementary age students. The next book I have is The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. This is actually a book I had my son read last year as a freshman for a book study. And shamefully, I never got around to reading it. Normally, I pre-read the books I'm going to assign, but I just did not have the time to do it. And it's been on my bookshelf forever, and I thought I've got to sit down and read this book. This is an autobiography. It's a true story of her and her family's life. She was a Dutch watchmaker, and her family was a part of the resistance. They basically helped to rescue and hide and move Jewish people who were trying to escape Hitler and his regime during World War II. Ultimately, they got caught and they ended up in a concentration camp, and Corrie was the only one to survive. Now, she later went on to tell her story and to become an evangelist, and this story is naturally filled with difficult topics and difficult themes. That's why I say if you have a more mature middle schooler, they could probably handle this material. or your high schoolers. But if you have a student who's particularly sensitive to these types of things, you may want to wait till they are a little bit older. But it's one of those stories that's just filled with faith and hope and the strength that it took to survive these time periods. Now, this next book I think would be great for high schoolers, particularly those who like books with themes of magic, but maybe also those who like themes of history, or maybe a student who doesn't care for history that much but enjoys magic, because this will make them enjoy both. It is A Radical Act of Free Magic. Now, this is actually a sequel to what was one of my favorite books that I've read in recent years, and that is A Declaration of the Rights of Magicians. And these two books together, I just love these books. They are set around the time right before the French Revolution. So in the years building up to the French Revolution, and it takes us right up to where we're introduced to Napoleon Bonaparte in the first book. And then the second book picks up where that one left off and then takes us for several years beyond that. So it's spread out over a period of time. And we're following characters who actually existed in history. Of course, Napoleon is obviously a key figure of that time. Many of the key players of the French Revolution, key players in England at the time, such as William Pitt and the people who were around him in his government. What is different about these books, though, is it throws in this idea of what if magic had existed, but the right to use it was restricted. So essentially, in the first book, each country has its own set of laws regarding magic, and they are enforced by the Knights Templar. Essentially, if you are a commoner, you are tested at birth to see if you have any potential magical abilities, and if you are braceleted, and every time you try to use magic, it will burn your wrist and it will alert the knights, and they will arrest you, and you will either be executed or spend your life in prison. But if you are an aristocrat or royalty, you can freely use your magic. So it's this whole idea that the rights were not equal between the two classes. And as we're kind of going in that time period, you think about what was going on in reality, right? The American Revolution, then you had the French Revolution, and it brings in discussion of everything from those who were trying to abolish the slave trade to what was going on with the wars and this whole fight for equality of the classes. But it puts that magical spin on it. And the first book was so well written. I mean, I just blew through that book. I love how we're introduced to different characters in different parts of the world. We have characters we're introduced to in the Caribbean, and they are later going to become even more important in the second book. We're introduced to players in France and in England, and some of them, when you first meet them, you're like, I don't understand how this person's going to be important to the story, but they just start to weave together in such a beautiful way. So I read the first book, and then I found out that there was a sequel, and I jumped on getting that sequel. And then it just took me a long time to have free time to sit down and read it. And once I did, I love the book. I love the book. It's fantastic. So highly, highly recommend. Like I said, if you have kids who enjoy books that have kind of a magic element, like if you had a child who was like a Harry Potter fan, maybe when they were younger, and they were looking for something that was like the next step up, this would be a great option. Plus, they're going to get introduced to the names and dates and some of the events that actually happened during that time period in England and France. So you're getting a little bit of history. You're just getting the magic twist. So I thought they were both a lot of fun. They're fairly clean books. You know, there's no language. There's a little bit of violence, but nothing overly graphic. I mean, we're talking about the French Revolution, and we all know what happened during the French Revolution. But overall, I would be totally fine with my kids reading them. Highly, highly recommend. Next up are a couple of books that I have been reading ahead of my teens. My teens are doing 2 courses that have a lot of literature built into them. They're reading different types of fiction and nonfiction books. So I actually have 3 nonfiction books that I have enjoyed, that I felt gave a lot of great information, and my kids will be reading them in the next couple of weeks. So the first one is called The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. So this is really discussing how social media and smartphones and the internet are really changing the way we think, our attention spans, our ability to make decisions. I think we all are probably aware of this, that things like TikTok are basically training our kids' brains to have a shorter attention span. But it's not just kids. We see it on things like Instagram and Facebook with the introduction of these short reels and constantly scrolling and constantly getting that new content every few seconds. And this really kind of dives into how that is fundamentally changing our brains and how they work. So I think it's a great book for parents to read, especially before your kids are getting to that age where they're going to start asking for cell phones and they're going to want access to social media, or they're getting online, just to kind of think about how much you want to allow. I think it's also great for our teens to read so they understand how that content that they're consuming is impacting them. So my daughter is going to be reading this before too long for her course, and I think that will be great for her. The next nonfiction book I have is called How the Overuse of Antibiotics is Fueling Our Modern Plagues or Missing Microbes. Now, this is another nonfiction book that is talking about basically what were good microbes within our body. And as a nurse, I talk to patients about this all the time. When they go on an antibiotic, I will let them know that, hey, that antibiotic is going to be killing off the good bacteria in your gut along with the bad bacteria in your body. And we'll do things like encourage them to take in probiotic yogurts and things like that to help regenerate that so they don't get indigestion and diarrhea and all of those things that can come along with it. So I was familiar with a lot of the concepts that this book was going to cover, and it talks a lot about the overuse of antibiotics and different medications and how those are negatively impacting what was naturally occurring in our bodies and maintaining balance. So I thought it was a thought-provoking book. It brought up some things that I didn't already have a good awareness of, even though I do work as a nurse. So I appreciated really just all of the information that they brought forth. I always take, books like this with a grain of salt, because I know that they're coming with a particular perspective that they're trying to push. And, as somebody who works in medicine, I'm not opposed to medications. We take antibiotics when we need them and things like that. But I do think it's another great way to just critically think about a topic such as medications and what types we should be taking and when. So again, just something that would be interesting to read. The last nonfiction book I have is one that my son is going to be reading soon for world history, so I wanted to read it in advance. It is called First They Killed My Father, A Daughter of Cambodia Remembers. So this is another autobiography, and it starts off in 1975 when her family was basically arrested and dispersed by the regime at the time. She went to train as a child soldier. Her siblings went to labor camps, and the family was essentially just scattered, and those that survived wouldn't be reunited until after this regime fell. And it's a heartbreaking story. There's obviously a lot of violence and violent moments in this story, and it really brings to light some of the tragedies that we might not be very familiar with. I certainly wasn't familiar with what was going on in that time period in that area, and I just, it's a story that breaks your heart. But I did want to read it in advance before I had my son read it, because I knew that it was probably going to be a difficult story to read, not in terms of, how it's written, but in terms of the topics that are covered. So I wanted to read it in advance. I'm definitely going to have him read it. I think he can handle the material. I think he's mature enough to handle the material, but I also think it's important for him and, for either of my kids to be aware of just how fortunate they are to be living in the place and the time that they are. When we read about these things that happened in fairly recent history, I mean, this only happened in the 70s, which really wasn't all that long ago. And there are still things like this that are happening in other countries today. So I feel like it's important for them to have an awareness of what's going on around the world. But that was the last nonfiction book that I read. The last book I have is a fiction book that has been on my shelf forever, and I finally got around to reading it, and that is The Echo of Old Books by Barbara Davis. In this, we follow a lady named Ashlyn who owns an old bookstore and does book restoration, but when she touches books, she can get a sense of the feelings and emotions of the previous owners. Well, two different books that appear to be almost like twins come into her possession, but they are telling the same love story but from two different perspectives, one from Hemi and one from Belle. And she knows right off the bat from reading the beginning of the books that this ends in a tragedy, but we are taken through those stories, reading basically chapter by chapter, one character's perspective, then the other, to try to find out what actually happened between these two. And it leads to her just becoming obsessed with finding out about these stories, finding out if it's true, trying to find the people involved. And it was a really interesting book to read because, again, we're jumping perspectives. One chapter might be Ashlyn talking about what's happening in the present and what's going on in her life. We hear the side of the story from Hemi and what he is thinking and feeling and what he's doing, and then Belle and her perspective. It's just a really interesting book. It was a very quick read. Now, fair warning, there's discussion of, there's romance, and it's definitely kind of on the adult side. It's not terribly graphic, but it's in there. So I probably wouldn't let my teen daughter read it, but I didn't think it was anything too out there, but I just enjoyed the book. I thought it was more interesting just having that jumping of perspectives and watching this story develop. And the whole time I was reading, I kept wondering, I was like, what happened between these two? And that's really what keeps the main character engaged, is she's desperately trying to figure out what happened to this grand romance to make it all go awry. But I liked it. I thought it was an interesting book to read. And I think that wraps up this stack of books for today. So those are just a couple of things that I have been reading that kind of fit with all different kinds of age ranges. I will go ahead and I will link these books down below if you would like to check out any of them. If you have any great book recommendations, be sure to let me know. I am always looking for more things to add to my TBR. Thanks for joining me for today's video, guys. I'll see you in the next one.